thanks everyone. As Jenna has said, my name is Joy, and for the past few months, I was working with AAA on a research study determining which interventions would be most successful in different African countries. I was supported by Moritz and Lynn as well. And before I start the presentation, I'd like to thank AAA for the opportunity, not only for me to present my findings, but also working with me on this and providing valuable feedback and insights along the way. So I will share my screen shortly. Jenna, please let me know if you can see my screen.
Yes, perfect.
Okay. Thank you. So as I said, the topic of my study was which types of animal advocacy intervention have the highest impact in African countries. And I was examining the effectiveness of 4 intervention types across 5 countries.
Okay.
These 5 countries were Egypt, Ghana, Kenya, Rwanda, and South Africa. So the first question that might come to mind is, why did I focus on these 5 countries? And the main aim of this was for me to try and represent the 5 regions of the African continent. So Egypt representing Northern Africa, Ghana, Western, Kenya, East, Rwanda, while some people might consider it Eastern Africa as well. For the purposes of this study, it was considered Central Africa, and South Africa obviously representing the southern part of Africa. I also chose countries, more specifically Egypt, Kenya, and South Africa, due to their ranking on the Animal Protection Index. And the Animal Protection Index is an index that was created by World Animal Protection, which rates countries based on their policies and legislation on animal welfare and provides helpful information for researchers. While Ghana and Rwanda were not included in this index, I still selected them to represent their respective regions. And the interventions that I looked at were the following: individual or public outreach. And what this means is outreach that's focused on behavioral change among the public, institutional outreach, which seeks to influence how laws and policies are made around animal advocacy. And institutional outreach was also used to represent lobbying towards corporations. Capacity building, which focuses on improving the capacities of stakeholders in animal welfare, sort of like what AAA is doing across the continent. And direct help, which provides direct services to animals, such as veterinary services, vaccinations, and animal rescues. At this point, it would be important to note that I was looking at mainly production animals or farm animals in the study. So to determine which intervention would be most successful in each country, I used the weighted factor model as part of my methodology. And I'll just take you a bit through what this model is. The weighted factor model involves generating criteria and weightings and evaluating how each option scores on each. So this weighted factor model that you can see on your screen, I borrowed it from Charity Entrepreneurship. And what you do is that with each metric, you assign weights, and against each intervention, I placed scores according to each metric. So it's typically used to weigh decisions on such as like what I had to determine which intervention would work best in which country. it would be possible for you to see this, the actual weighted factor model that I produced in the report that was generated. So if you're curious and you want to know more about it, you can check out the executive summary, but also the report has the same model. So with the weighted factor model, the main question would be, why choose such a model? And the thing is, it has several advantages. As I said, it's useful in situations where you have a large number of different quantitative and qualitative factors that need to be consolidated. And it also helps in identifying factors that decisively influence the final scores, and therefore makes results a bit easier to understand. So you can understand, looking at this model, I can go back. It's easier to determine which factor makes which intervention more favorable. So with this specific study, a range of criteria, sorry, apologies. And I drew this criteria from Charity Entrepreneurship's criteria. They've created a list of criteria that should be considered when looking at animal advocacy interventions. And I used weightings from a past study run by AAA. So with the first criteria, that was the strength of idea. And what this means in lay terms is how promising the idea or the intervention looks. And we base it on 3 metrics. The first being evidence base. So how much dependable evidence can be found in this intervention? The second was cost effectiveness. So here, looking at the number of lives, the number of animal lives saved per dollar, for example, and the flexibility. So how flexible is this intervention? For example, can it use staff who are able to work on several different interventions? Or are there multiple ways to run this intervention? Or can one branch into several different interventions? The second criteria was execution difficulty. So what this means is how difficult would this intervention be to implement? The first metric under that would be metric focus. And this refers to the metric that the intervention is related to. So how easy is it to measure the metrics? How many animals can you say have been saved from this intervention? And how directly the metric measured relates to improving animal welfare. The second, under execution difficulty, was scalability. How easy would it be to scale this intervention? The third was timing. So is now the appropriate time to run an intervention? What factors would affect the timing around that? The next criteria was limiting factor. So these are the factors that may limit an intervention. The first being the counterfactual replaceability, or what is called neglectedness. And what this means is basically the number of organizations that are working in this area, whether these organizations are big or competent, and are they doing a good job? The funding availability, what is the availability of funds or donors available who are interested in funding this intervention? The talent availability, basically what skill sets are run this intervention, and are staff with these skills available within the talent market, or is there a talent gap? The size of problem was basically how many animals are affected, and on what scale of the intervention would it be delivered at? With the logistical bottlenecks, this refers to the challenges that would hinder the success of the intervention in question. And these can include poor infrastructure, low cultural and political receptivity to the intervention, and lack of specialized transportation, just to name a few. With the externalities, this is the last criteria. What externalities meant was the possible negative and positive side effects. So the risk of negative or no impact, basically the risk that an intervention has to create negative consequences or no change at all. And one example that I find useful was, would a protest, for example, lead to feelings of anger among the public, or would it create no change at all? And then for the flow-through effects, this refers to the impact created towards animal welfare, as well as positive impacts within and across other cause areas outside of animal welfare. So what did I do with the weighted factor model? What I did here was I gathered evidence on 4 intervention types: the public outreach, institutional, capacity building, and direct help. And I scored each country on 5 for each metric, with 1 always representing the least favorable and 5 representing the most favorable score. And these are the final results once I was able to tabulate everything. Sorry. So as you can see, for the results of the weighted factor model, in all 5 countries, the most impactful type of intervention is individual or public outreach, followed by institutional outreach. And you can see this here, indicated by the green. And the scores for individual outreach are generally the highest because this intervention does not demonstrate major weaknesses on the metrics covered in the weighted factor model. Compared to the other interventions, it was highly scalable, and this was because a lot of individual outreach can be done online. It has a large talent pool to draw from, again, because the skill set required to do individual outreach is not very technical. And there's also a large availability of volunteers interested in doing individual outreach. And it also had good timing. And when I talk about good timing here, I talk about in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, a lot of people are having conversations around zoonotic illnesses. In fact, a study was done and it found that 76% of South Africans changed their buying habits based on animal welfare. Good timing, good timing is also related to the fact that there's the increased uptake of mobile technology on the African continent. And there's also the increased proliferation of animal welfare interventions in each of these 5 countries. In contrast, institutional outreach suffers from a high risk of no or negative impact across all of the 5 countries. And the reason why I say that is because a lot of institutional outreach, such as petitions to the government and to corporations, tends to be ignored. For example, in Kenya, there are very low documented prosecutions of those who've hurt animals or who've abused them. In Rwanda, there's the risk of errors in legislative reform because a lot of policymakers who are working on these laws that affect animals may not necessarily have had training to draw up laws to protect those animals effectively. So you'll find a lot of gaps. in legislation. In Ghana, I also found that there was a risk of negative impact for institutional outreach. For example, if a law was to come into place that requires people to hunt animals before slaughter, that actually goes against the Islamic law. Such meat is not considered halal. And so there's a potential for backlash and negative impact by imposing such laws. So when we look back, we see a lot of similarities in the scoring, especially around individual outreach and institutional outreach. And I would say this is because of the shared socioeconomic similarities across the 5 countries. I would say that's the reason for such scores. In South Africa, I found that institutional outreach scored very highly, almost on par with individual outreach. And this is because of the high evidence base of institutional outreach in South Africa. There's a lot of work going on there, and it's relatively successful, and that's why it scored almost on par with public outreach. On the other hand, direct help was not promising at all in South Africa, but it seemed more promising in Egypt and Kenya than in the other countries. And this would be because, again, low evidence of success in direct help interventions in South Africa, but there is evidence of success of the same interventions in Kenya, especially around vet services. In Egypt, there's evidence of the success of vet workers who are able to transfer knowledge and create behavioral change among communities, and therefore reduce the prevalence of highly pathogenic avian influenza. In Rwanda, individual outreach clearly outranks the other possible intervention types. For capacity building, this generally performed weaker across most metrics than the other interventions, especially on metric focus. It was incredibly hard to measure the impact of capacity building efforts on the number of animal lives saved. Direct help also scored weakly across most metrics, even though it has a low risk of no or negative impact, and it tackles a significant problem in the studied. Yeah, and the reason I would say direct help scored so weakly is because of poor timing. Again, this project was done in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, this study. And what I found was that a lot of direct help interventions were unable to access animals because of lockdowns. There's also the low talent availability. There's a shortage of workers in many of these countries. And yeah, that's why it scored so weakly. So I've talked a lot about what this research found and why the scores were what they were, mean for animal advocates who are working in these countries. So, for example, the high risk of no or negative impact for institutional outreach. What practical implications does that have? As I said before, in South Africa, there's a risk of political and corporate institutions ignoring lobbying efforts. The same is true in Kenya and Egypt. In Rwanda, there's the risk of errors and gaps in legislative reforms. And in Ghana, there's a risk of negative implications if laws are put around the stunning of animals before slaughter. And the reason why I bring the issue of institutional outreach up is because in traditional studies around animal advocacy, a lot of those studies have preferred institutional outreach over individual outreach. But in this study, you'll see it's vice versa, a preference for individual over institutional. The study found that individual outreach is likely to be most impactful in all 5 countries. And what does this mean practically? What it means is that animal advocates, organizations, and individuals should first aim to create awareness among the public regarding animal advocacy. So focusing on the sentience of animals, the importance of animal welfare, and even diet change. But as we talk to the public across the continent about this, it's also important to recognize that there could be of negative reactions from individuals. A lot of people may feel that diet change, especially, or the sentience of animals, are ideals that are un-African. And back to what I was talking about earlier, with the preference over institutional and individual outreach. While public outreach may not be as effective as institutional outreach, where there's the high awareness of animal rights and welfare, you don't see as much awareness and knowledge across the African continent as in the West. And so I feel that public outreach can be relevant, especially where the animal advocacy movement is still small. Now, as part of this study, and as hard as we worked on it, there were still quite a few limitations that should be thought about as you consider these results. And the first would be, there was a limited information concerning animal welfare interventions across the African continent, especially in Egypt. In fact, in Egypt, there was quite a bit of this was by considering data and information from a country in Asia that has a similar context, in this case, Vietnam. And I chose Vietnam because it ranks at the same level as Egypt on the API. Both rank poorly. And both countries also have had animal festivals that have been criticized as being inhumane. So as you look at these results, bear in mind that a lot of the information and a lot of the scores that were placed against Egypt was also drawn from the Vietnamese context. There was also missing information on the cost-effectiveness of animal welfare interventions, except for the cost-effectiveness of direct help. And how I mitigated this was I used information largely from the US, and that was a decision based on the need for such data. It was most available in the American context. And this was not discounted in the weighted factor model. So as you also look at the cost effectiveness, the results around that, please bear that in mind. I also conducted the study purely by desk research. I took to the field and conduct practical experiments. And I think how this can be mitigated is for you as animal advocates and individuals to also consider doing your own research on the interventions that would work best for your country context. And that's why I come to the point of generalization. While I talk about which intervention would be best, please bear in mind that this is only one piece of research. please also consider other findings and try and see how these findings that I found could be wrong or right as you make your decisions. Thank you. So I'll pause there for questions or feedback, maybe compliments. Yeah, thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Joy. It's really so lovely just to be able to hear your research and how you went through the process of gathering this data and what you are able to provide us with by doing this research in the first place. So thank you very much for that. And yeah, so maybe we can just open the floor. If anyone has got any questions, you're welcome either to type it in the chat or you can just unmute yourself and ask your question. Otherwise, you can raise a hand and that's also perfectly fine. Yeah, so the floor is open. Okay, well, I don't mind asking a question for now. You know, while you were presenting, a couple of things came to mind and I just wanted to also ask you a question or two. So the one thing I wanted to ask is if you had used the weighted factor model before in previous research you've done, and if it was your first time using it, what was your experience with it? Was it easy to learn? Was it difficult? Is that something that you think organizations could use? Because you suggested that maybe they do their own research. So is this a model that could be learned quite easily? Just your experience with it. Yeah.
Thanks, Jenna. So the weighted factor model, this was my first time conducting research with it. It was, I think it was a great experience. I would recommend it, but then I would not say it did not have its challenges. It's definitely something that requires patience, requires a lot of reiteration, and I'm sure Moritz can confirm, can attest. The thing also with the weighted factor model to bear in mind is that it's quite subjective. Once you see the wider model, you can see that I put in scores based on my opinion. And what we tried to do to circumvent that or mitigate that was to run sensitivity analysis, or rather Moritz did that. He's a guru on that. But I would definitely recommend the model. I think just bear in mind, you have to keep coming back. Maybe one way to also mitigate the subjectivity in addition to sensitivity analysis, maybe to also ask multiple people to score each criteria and each metric so that you can find an average. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you so much, Joy. Because I hadn't actually come across the weighted factor model until the research that AAA was doing. So yourself, Lynn, and Moritz. Yeah, and it's a very interesting model to use. And, you know, it's something that I think we definitely need in Africa is just more research happening that leads to practical, just practical actions being born from that research, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Does anyone else have any questions or comments that they'd like to ask Joy? You can also ask Moritz, he's also on the call if there's something in particular. Perfect. So Innocent, I see your hand is raised. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much, Gina. I don't have a question. It's just a comment. Yeah, this is so nice, Joy. You've done good. I just like the replicability of this study and how you sampled the countries, and that the same can be replicated in any place or any country in Africa. And I've had the weighted model. Actually, I've had it for the first time from you, and I'm very interested in learning more about this. Thank you.
Thanks, Innocent. Yeah, definitely try out the weighted factor model. Try it out for your own country context. I think you'll definitely see some very interesting results. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for that, Innocent. Daniel, I also see your hand is raised, so you're welcome to ask your question.
Hi, everyone. Joy, thank you very much for this presentation. My question is on the negative reaction. You made mention countries like Ghana where there might be expected blowback on certain enforcing certain regulations. I want to find out whether there is a way to go around this particular form of reaction so that it wouldn't lead or escalate to something that is not expected. So as animal welfare advocates, what can we do about this negative reaction that is expected?
Thanks, Daniel. So while not an expert on handling such negative reactions, I would say the first step, and maybe the most important, would be to understand the country context, especially if you're doing individual and institutional outreach, trying to figure out a way to sort of package the intervention. If there's a risk of negative reactions, if it's seen as maybe being un-African, maybe trying to package it in a way that it seems African. I would say that would be the place to start from. Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So this is also something I wanted to also ask you, Joy, because in your research, it shows that, you know, if there is this, if it is better to, I don't know how to word this, if the intervention that seems to be the most effective is public outreach, rather than, let's say, direct help, is there a way for organizations, I don't know if this came up in your research or, you know, like just through contemplating the findings, for, you know, should organizations then look at pivoting to doing more public outreach rather than direct help, or is it something that they could do, you know, both at the same time? Because I do, you know, just from the experience with AAA, a lot of organizations are doing direct help, and public outreach is kind of a side project or side program to that direct help, especially, let's say, with veterinary care. Direct help is also a way for organizations to, you know, get the funding that they need in order for the NGO to exist in the first place. So yeah, just maybe some ideas that you came across in your research regarding that grappling between choosing which intervention and how to prioritize it in the first place.
Yeah, thanks, Jenna. So I would say for organizations that are doing direct help, I would not recommend for them to pivot completely. What I would recommend is, incorporating public outreach into their work. And the good thing about that is it's incredibly flexible. I've seen a lot of organizations while I was doing my research, I saw a lot of organizations incorporating individual outreach into their direct help work. It's possible with the considerations of funding availability. With individual outreach, you can also scale down the costs. So maybe focusing on blogging or online outreach or having a more active Facebook page, I would say would go a long way into amplifying your work and also helping you benefit from that increased awareness. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that. And I see there's a question from Calvin in the chat box. So he is asking, what effective advocacy tactics would you recommend for individual outreach? Also, maybe some tactics for corporate outreach.
Okay, so I think I've even just mentioned some tactics for individual outreach. So work, getting bloggers on board to increase awareness around animal welfare and the work you're doing. For corporate outreach, I would say protests, if possible, would also be helpful. Even okay, depending on the country context, lobbying corporations. This one is more so for countries like South Africa, where there tends to be a big culture around that, where you can lobby an organization to change their production measures to make them more animal friendly. Yeah, I hope I've answered your question, Kelvin.
Yeah, sorry, Joy, I just want to make an addition on that one. Besides looking at policy and also looking at the other one which you have just mentioned, I think also networking with the platforms that are there within the the infrastructure which you are working in would be ideal. So, for example, I'll give an example of Malawi, where I live. There are government, platforms whereby stakeholders would convene, and in that sense, corporate outreach would make more sense. Networking with other like-minded organizations and other organizations that are within a certain platform, which tends to meet on a periodical time, I think, and advancing your agenda would be quite ideal. Yeah, so I just wanted to add on that one.
Yeah, no, perfect. Thank you. I'd say also considering consortium of organizations, as you've said, lobbying as a group rather than lobbying as individual organizations would also go a long way. Yeah.
And maybe, thanks, Joy, for the presentation. I can also jump in here quickly. Just one point that came to my mind is that, of course, every work that you do has to be tailored to the local context, right? So this is just a broad study, of course. So Joy had to look at 5 different countries and a lot of information that she had to digest and distill down into these final scores. And I think those are really good, broad findings and recommendations. But of course, as Jenna also hinted to in her question, you cannot change what you're doing from yesterday to today or from today to tomorrow, and you shouldn't probably. So of course, everything depends on the local context and what you're good at and what you're working on. Also, in general, for the strategy, maybe for the longer term, where more funding should go into, what new organizations could spring up and could do, or where you can shift your focus over the long run. All of these things. I wanted to emphasize that to bear in mind.
Yeah, thank you so much for jumping in, Sopani and Moritz. Sopani and Moritz are both also part of AAA. And yeah, thank you for giving us some extra feedback. I'm not too sure if anyone else has any questions or comments. Feel free to raise your hand, or you can type it in the chat box as well before we close the session. So I wonder if maybe, oh wait, here's Matilda before I before I keep asking my own questions. So a question from Matilda. What's something you've learned that seemed especially important to you or perhaps surprised you?
Well, yeah, that's a difficult question. I think what I learned and that seemed especially important to me was, I think it wasn't so much learning something, but I think this study deepened my understanding of animals. I felt I definitely more connected to the cause. I felt I wanted to do more. I think it deepened that passion and it deepened that drive. Yeah, and I think one thing that did surprise me was, and this is just something small, is I did not know that stunning of animals goes against is Islamic law. I thought that was quite surprising. I told so many people about it, and no one had known. That was really interesting to me. But all in all, what this project did was it deepened that passion and deepened that drive, for improving animal welfare across the continent. Yeah.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I suppose when you go on this research journey, how it brings up just that importance of the work that we're all trying to do, and that goal, I suppose, how it can seem so far away, and you have to really just kind of keep working at it step by step. And yeah, I mean, that's the thing. As soon as you start looking at the research, you realize that it nearly feels that it's this, massive issue that can never be fixed. But then it requires people to do the research and do the work to at least try to fix it. Yeah, so it really is. I enjoyed your research so much, Joy, and just the amount of time and effort you put into it. I really appreciate you doing that. And, not enough research is being done on the African continent, especially research by Africans about Africa is also so important. And yeah, just encouraging organizations to do their own research. If you do need any help with learning more about weight factor models or where to start with doing your own research, you're more than welcome to email anyone at Animal Advocacy Africa just to ask questions and start engaging about how to do more research, because we really just need to be able to do our own research on the continent and really be able to step up the statistics and the work that really helps to justify why we're doing what we're doing in the first place. So thank you very much to Joy and to Moritz for working on this project and on this report. I really appreciate it, and it helps us so much as AAA as well.
Yeah, no, thank you as well. As I said, thank you to the entire team, and thank you for everyone who has attended this webinar. You've been an engaging and attentive audience. Yeah, I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much. So thank you, Joy, and thank you everyone for joining us. I really appreciate you just being present and hearing more about this research. And we really hope that it helps you make decisions as organizations and to just keep the animal advocacy movement progressing in Africa, because that's really what it needs, is to just keep moving forward. So thank you to everyone for showing up. Nice, thank you. And have a lovely evening or day wherever you are. Thank you so much, Joy.
Thank you. Thank you, Jenna. Thank you, everyone.